Linnet Vane learned early that beside her perfect sister, her role was to stay quiet, invisible, and easy to forget. At an elegant ball at Thornleigh Hall, her deepest humiliation unfolds before all of society. A gentleman mocks her on the dance floor, her own sister encourages the laughter, and Linnet believes she will never be able to lift her head again. Until Gideon Harrowden, the mysterious Duke of Caldermere, crosses the ballroom and silences everyone with a single sentence, "Laugh at her again, and answer to me." With that one act, the Duke transforms the mocked sister into the most watched woman of the night. But his defense does not end with the dance. As Linnet begins to discover the tenderness hidden beneath Gideon's cold reserve, she must also face her family's jealousy, society's whispers, and the painful fear that his attention may be nothing more than pity. Gideon, scarred by an old betrayal, no longer trusts love easily. Linnet, used to being overlooked, cannot believe a man like him could truly choose her. Between glittering ballrooms, quiet gardens, and an old melody played at the pianoforte, they will discover that true love is not born from pity, but from recognition. And for the first time, Linnet must decide whether she will remain the forgotten sister or accept the place she was always worthy of beside the man who saw her when everyone else laughed. The ribbon on Linnet Vane's gown would not lie flat. She smoothed it with the careful patience of a young woman who had learned that small imperfections were safer to mend in silence. The gown had once belonged to Seraphine, though no one said so plainly. It had been altered, lengthened, and pressed until every borrowed seam looked respectable. It was not ugly, but it was not made for her. Behind her, Seraphine turned from the looking-glass with the satisfied air of a woman who knew every candle in the ballroom would favor her. "How very soft that shade makes you look," Seraphine said. Linnet met her sister's eyes in the mirror. Soft? Pale, perhaps, but pale can be modest if one manages it properly. Mrs. Vane glanced up from her gloves. "Seraphine, do not tease. Linnet, stand straight. If you keep lowering your chin, people will think you expect to be overlooked." Linnet did not answer that people overlooked her quite naturally, without assistance from her posture. The maid stepped toward Linnet to fasten the loose ribbon near her sleeve, but Seraphine lifted one hand. "Not yet, Molly. This curl has slipped." The maid returned at once. Linnet tied the ribbon herself. She could not command beauty, admiration, or her mother's approval, but she could command her hands. Mrs. Vane rose and inspected both daughters. Seraphine received anxious pride. Linnet received correction. "Do not speak unless spoken to at length," Mrs. Vane said. "This house party matters. Your sister has a chance to be admired by very important people." "I understand, Mama." Sadness. Seraphine smiled. "Linnet always understands. She is very good at standing near walls and understanding." Sadness. The music began below, faint through the floorboards. When her mother and sister moved toward the door, Linnet remained behind long enough to touch the folded paper in her reticule, an old handwritten ballad, worn at the creases, as if the melody could lend her courage. Then she followed them into the corridor. Thornleigh Hall had been built for display, with a sweeping staircase, watchful portraits, and a ballroom blazing with chandeliers, mirrors, flowers, and expectation. Linnet entered behind her mother and sister, aware of how neatly society arranged itself before anyone spoke. Seraphine belonged to the center of the room. Linnet belonged to its edges. She took her place near a pillar garlanded with pale roses. Gentlemen bowed. Ladies dipped. Mothers calculated. Young women laughed as if laughter itself had been rehearsed by a French dancing master. Then the room altered. "The Duke of Caldermere," someone whispered. Linnet had heard his name before arriving at Thornleigh Hall. Everyone had. Gideon Harrowden, Duke of Caldermere, was wealthy, unmarried, and difficult. He entered in dark evening dress with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without raising his voice. Seraphine's posture changed. She became more luminous when she knew she was observed. "Do you see him?" Mrs. Vane murmured. "Yes, Mama," Seraphine said. The Duke greeted his host with correct reserve. Seraphine, with admirable timing, moved into his path just as Lady Durnford presented her. The Duke bowed. He did not linger. For one brief moment, as he turned from her sister, his gaze found Linnet at the edge of the room. She had been looking at him with curiosity rather than invitation, and when his eyes met hers, she looked away because honest attention felt more intimate than flattery. Seraphine noticed anyway. A few minutes later, Mr. Bristow approached. He was a young gentleman of glossy hair, narrow wit, and confidence enough to mistake cruelty for charm. "Miss Vane," he said, bowing toward Linnet with a flourish too large to be sincere. "Might I beg the honor?" Linnet glanced toward her mother. Mrs. Vane looked startled, then relieved. Seraphine's eyes shone with encouragement. "You must accept," Seraphine said softly. "It is not every evening one receives such gallantry." There was no graceful refusal left to Linnet. She placed her hand where Mr. Bristow indicated and followed him to the set. The dance began well enough. Linnet knew the steps, but Mr. Bristow's timing soon became careless. He moved too late, then too soon, drawing her half a pace out of position. When she corrected herself, he smiled down at her. "No need to look so grave, Miss Vane. A lady may be forgiven for inexperience." "I am not inexperienced, sir." "Ah, then perhaps only nervous." The couple nearest them heard. Linnet saw the flicker of amusement pass between them. Heat climbed her neck, but she kept moving, counting silently, willing the music to end. Mr. Bristow turned her too sharply. Linnet's slipper caught the hem of her altered gown, and she faltered. It was slight, hardly enough to disturb the figure, but he stepped back as if she had nearly fallen into him. "My dear Miss Vane," he said, his voice pitched for nearby ears, "you must not be so grateful for attention that you forget the dance." The first laugh came from behind a fan, then another. Seraphine's voice floated from the edge of the set, sweet and clear. "Poor Linnet, she does try." The laughter spread, not loud enough to be vulgar, but sharp enough to cut. Linnet stood in the middle of the ballroom, every candle bright upon her face, every glance pinning her in place. She wanted to disappear so fully that even her own name could not find her. But she did not run. She drew herself upright. Then a man's voice cut through the music. "Enough!" The musicians faltered. Conversation died in uneven fragments. The Duke of Caldermere stood several paces away, his gaze not on Linnet, but on the people who had laughed. His face was controlled, yet the stillness in him was more alarming than anger. Mr. Bristow gave a foolish little bow. "Your Grace, we meant no offense." The Duke looked at him until the young man's smile failed. Then Gideon Harrowden turned his attention to the room. "Anger, laugh at her again," he said, each word cold and clear, "and answer to me." No one moved. Linnet felt the silence as strongly as she had felt the laughter. The Duke stepped toward her. His expression altered when he looked at her, not softened exactly, but steadied. He bowed with formal respect, deeper than Mr. Bristow had done, deeper than anyone expected. "Miss Vane," he said, "if you are not engaged for the next dance, may I have the honor?" Linnet could feel Seraphine staring. She could feel her mother's alarm, the guests' astonishment, Mr. Bristow's humiliation, but the Duke had asked her, not them. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "You may, Your Grace." She placed her hand in his. The next dance began as silence became music. At first, Linnet moved with care, afraid any misstep would prove the room right. But the Duke's lead was measured and certain. He did not drag her into display. He gave her time. "You need not prove anything to them," he said under the cover of the music. Linnet looked up at him. That is easy for a duke to say. For the first time, something like interest touched his eyes. "Yes, it is." The honesty of that answer unsettled her more than a compliment would have done. When the music ended, the Duke released her hand with care and bowed again, lower than courtesy required. The room noticed. Linnet noticed too. By breakfast the next morning, Thornleigh Hall had learned to pronounce Linnet Vane's name differently. Not warmly, not yet, but with careful civility. Even Mr. Bristow avoided her eyes, which Linnet found more satisfying than an apology. Seraphine buttered a slice of toast with delicate precision. "You must be relieved, Linnet." Linnet looked at her. Relieved? That his grace was so kind. Some gentlemen have a noble instinct toward the unfortunate. Mrs. Vane's cup clicked against its saucer. "Seraphine." "I only mean," Seraphine continued, "that one must not mistake rescue for preference. It would be painful to build castles on a gentleman's pity." The word entered Linnet quietly and lodged where the laughter had been. Pity. It made sense. A duke might defend a woman because a room had behaved badly. A duke might dance with her to make a point. That did not mean he had seen anything in her worth remembering by morning. "I am not building castles," Linnet said. "Good," Mrs. Vane said quickly. "Courtesy from a man of rank must be received with gratitude and forgotten with discretion." The breakfast room shifted near the doorway. The Duke of Caldermere had entered. Seraphine brightened, turning her shoulder just enough to invite approach. Gideon greeted the hostess, exchanged a few necessary words with Lord Thornleigh, then crossed the room without haste. Not to Seraphine. To Linnet. "Miss Vane," he said, bowing, "I trust you slept well." Every conversation near them thinned. Linnet felt Seraphine's stillness like a hand closing around the room. Her mother's warning rang fresh in her mind. Courtesy, gratitude, discretion. She lifted her chin. "Well enough, Your Grace. Thank you." His gaze held hers. "I am glad to hear it." It was not a declaration, but it was daylight, and he had crossed a crowded breakfast room to say it. For the first time that morning, the word pity did not sit so comfortably in Linnet's chest. Across the table, Seraphine's smile remained flawless and cold. Linnet understood something with uneasy clarity. The laughter had ended, but Seraphine had not. The music room at Thornleigh Hall was rarely empty, but that morning it held a quiet so complete that Linnet felt briefly forgotten. The pianoforte was older, darker, and less admired than the gilt harp near the window. Linnet went to it as one might go to a familiar bench in a neglected garden. Her hands still felt the breakfast room, Seraphine's smooth voice, her mother's warning, the word pity slipping like a pin beneath her skin. Gideon Harrowden had crossed the room to speak to her, yet Seraphine had a talent for making hope appear foolish before it had time to breathe. Linnet lifted the pianoforte lid and touched one key lightly. The note answered in a low, mellow voice. She sat, then opened the bench to search for her ballad. Her fingers brushed paper already inside. It was not hers. The sheet was yellowed, written in a fine hand, its ink faded brown. The melody was the same old ballad she carried, but this copy had different words in the margin, a verse she had never seen. Curiosity, Linnet read the first line, then stopped. It felt improper, not because the words were secret, but because they had clearly once belonged to someone's private tenderness. Still, the melody called to her. She placed the page on the stand and began to play. At first she played only to remember her breath. The notes came gently, one phrase answering another, like a question asked in a room where no one intended to laugh. She heard only the footman's polite cough when he passed the open door. Linnet stopped at once. A moment later, a deeper voice spoke from beyond the threshold. "Forgive me, Miss Vane, I did not mean to intrude." The Duke of Caldermere stood in the doorway, waiting instead of entering, giving her the choice of whether to receive him. Linnet rose. "Your Grace." "I heard music," he said. "That is a poor excuse for lingering outside a door, but it is the true one. I thought I was alone." "You were, until I behaved badly enough to listen." There was a dry honesty that made the admission less alarming. Linnet glanced at the music on the stand. "It is only an old ballad." "Not only, I think. Many ladies play better. I do not doubt it. Many ladies also speak when they have nothing to say." His gaze moved briefly to the pianoforte. "You played as though the music had been waiting for you." No compliment of Seraphine's had ever sounded like that. This was quieter, and therefore more dangerous. "I play for myself." Linnet said. "That may be why it is worth hearing." The words stayed between them. Linnet looked down at the old sheet. This copy was in the bench. I hope I have not used something private. Gideon's expression altered. My mother knew that melody. She used to hum it in the mornings. I had forgotten the second phrase until I heard you play it. The memory stood there plainly, like a door he had not meant to open. "Would you like me to stop?" Linnet asked. "No." His answer came too quickly. Then he mastered it. "No, Miss Vane. I would like, someday, to hear it again." She should have said something graceful. Instead, she said the truth. "I might play it again." The faintest warmth reached his eyes. "Then I shall consider that a generous answer." By afternoon, the house had recovered its appetite for arrangement. Tea was laid on the garden terrace. Linnet took a chair near the far end. Seraphine sat near Lady Durnford in pale blue, while Mrs. Vane hovered close enough to approve every sentence. Gideon stood at a distance with Lord Thornleigh. Linnet tried not to look toward him. She failed once. He was not watching Seraphine. The knowledge gave her courage, just as Seraphine's voice floated across the terrace. "One must be careful with Linnet," Seraphine was saying to Lady Durnford. "She has a tender nature. Too much attention unsettles her." "Does it?" Lady Durnford asked. "She is unused to society's brighter moments. A gentleman's kindness may appear very grand to a girl who has rarely received it." Mrs. Vane gave a nervous laugh. "Seraphine means only that Linnet is innocent." "Innocence," Lady Durnford said, "is charming when properly guided." Linnet set down her cup. To object would make her seem childish. To remain would make her an exhibit. "Do excuse me. I promised myself a turn before the air cooled." Seraphine's smile did not falter. "Of course, walking is always restorative when one's spirits are overtaxed." Linnet inclined her head and left the terrace by the shallow stone steps. She did not hurry. If one had only dignity left, one must not drag it behind like a torn hem. She reached the lower path before she allowed herself to stop, where roses climbed a wall and the gravel path curved into a privacy of hedges. "Miss Vane!" Gideon stood several paces away, hat in hand. He had not followed so closely as to corner her. He had come far enough to be seen, and stopped far enough to be refused. "May I walk with you?" he asked. Linnet looked past him toward the terrace. "Will it cause comment?" "Almost certainly." The answer surprised a small laugh from her. "Then perhaps you ought not." "Perhaps. But I have spent many years doing what I ought. It has not made me especially agreeable." "No," she said, then realized what she had said. His mouth moved almost into a smile. "A severe judgment." "A fair one, I think." "Then I shall try to improve by walking quietly." She should have sent him back. Instead, she turned along the rose path, and after a moment he fell into step beside her. For several minutes they spoke of ordinary things. Ordinary conversation felt safer, until Gideon said, "You dislike being watched." "Most people do not watch to understand," Linnet said. "They watch to decide." "That is well put. You dislike it too." "I dislike being pursued." "That is not the same thing." "No," he admitted. "But both are forms of being mistaken for something else." She looked at him. "What are you mistaken for?" "A title, a fortune, a solution to ambitious mothers. People admire rank because it costs them nothing. Real regard requires attention." Linnet considered that. Being ignored also teaches attention. One sees what others do not trouble to hide. And what do you see? The garden seemed to ask more courage of her than the ballroom had. "I see that you defended me from cruelty," she said. "I do not know whether you did so from honor or pity." He stopped walking. "At first," he said, "from anger. A room full of well-bred people had chosen to be small, and you bore it with more grace than any of them deserved." He paused. "Afterward, from admiration." Surprise admiration was a word for Seraphine. For beauties and accomplished daughters. Not for Linnet, standing beside a hedge in a gown remade from someone else's triumph. Surprise, Gideon did not press her to respond. When they returned toward the terrace, Linnet felt no safer than before, but she felt less alone in her danger. That evening at dinner, the hostess performed a social miracle so subtle that no one could accuse her of intention and no one could miss its effect. Linnet was placed within easy conversation of the Duke of Caldermere. Seraphine was not. Mrs. Vane's face tightened, but there was no graceful protest to make. Seraphine took her chair with a perfect smile. The first course was hardly served before Seraphine began to shine across the table, speaking of London assemblies, a private concert, and Lady Thornleigh's flowers, with exactly the right degree of praise. Linnet remained quiet until Gideon turned to her. "Do you prefer London or the country, Miss Vane?" Several faces shifted toward her. Linnet felt the old instinct to give the smallest possible answer. Then she remembered the garden path. "The country," she said. "London is impressive, but it rarely seems to rest. The country has pauses in it." Gideon looked at her, as if the answer had pleased him beyond its words. "And you value pauses?" "Yes. People reveal themselves in them." A gentleman across the table, one who had been near enough to laugh during the dance, cleared his throat. "That is an uncommon observation, Miss Vane." "Is it? I suppose quiet people depend upon them." The gentleman flushed, but he bowed his head with real respect. "Then quiet people may have the advantage of us." For the first time that evening, conversation gathered around Linnet without swallowing her. Gideon asked about music, and Linnet said she played a little, for private pleasure. "A little?" Gideon repeated. She gave him a look. "Enough for pauses, Your Grace." Positivity, that won a low ripple of amusement. Not cruel, not sharp. Warm. Positivity. Across the table, Seraphine's fingers closed around the stem of her glass. Later, when a footman placed a small dish of sugared rose petals near her plate, she took one between her fingers and crushed it flat against the linen. After dinner came cards, then conversation, then a restless shifting of guests through adjoining rooms. Late that night, Linnet slipped away toward the conservatory. The conservatory was warm with orange blossom and damp earth. A small pianoforte stood among the palms. Before Linnet could begin to play, a voice said gently, "You left this in the music room." Gideon stood near the entrance, holding the folded ballad. "I did not read it," he said at once. "Not beyond knowing what it was. I would not take such a liberty." She believed him. That, too, was dangerous. He offered the page. She took it, and for an instant their fingers nearly touched. Not quite. The space between them felt more intimate than contact would have been in any crowded room. "My copy is different from the one in the bench," she said. "Then perhaps the song has been keeping secrets from both of us." She smiled, despite herself. Songs often do. "Will you play it?" He was not asking her to entertain the room. He was asking to hear something she had chosen to keep private. Linnet sat again. The first notes rose softly beneath the glass. The melody sounded different in the conservatory, fuller, as though the leaves and moonlight had taken it in and returned it changed. When the final phrase faded, Gideon said nothing for several moments. Then, quietly, "My mother used to hum that when she thought no one could hear her. She must have loved it." "I think she did. I had not remembered how much until you played." Linnet's hands rested in her lap. Memories are strange things. They hide until music finds them. He looked at her then, and the reserve that usually held him apart seemed less like coldness than discipline. A man keeping guard over a room no one else could see. "Positivity. You make silence feel less empty," he said. "Positivity." Linnet could not answer. Outside the conservatory glass, a pale skirt moved briefly between shadows. Neither of them saw it. The next afternoon, the drawing room was full of rain-colored light and well-dressed malice. Ladies embroidered, gentlemen turned pages they did not read, and Lady Durnford presided near the hearth with severe attention. Linnet entered late enough to know she had been discussed. Seraphine sat beside Lady Durnford, her face arranged in concern. "I only fear," Seraphine was saying, "that kindness may be misunderstood. A gentleman of his Grace's rank must often feel obliged to protect those placed in awkward positions." Lady Durnford's needle paused. "Obligation is not courtship." "Exactly, and a girl unused to admiration may not see the distinction." Mrs. Vane looked pale. "No one wishes for embarrassment." A guest near the window murmured, "The Duke is honorable, of course." But honor can be mistaken by hopeful young ladies. Linnet stood just inside the room, every word landing with careful precision. They were not laughing this time. That almost made it worse. Laughter could be condemned. Concern wore gloves. Seraphine saw her and widened her eyes, as though distressed to have been overheard. "Linnet, dear, we were only speaking for your good." "For my good," Linnet repeated. Mrs. Vane rose halfway. "Come sit with me." But Linnet did not move toward her. She looked at the women, at the half-turned faces, at the room waiting to see whether she would confirm their judgment by breaking beneath it. "My dignity," she said, "does not depend upon whether any gentleman marries me, nor does gratitude require me to pretend I have no understanding." The room stilled. Color rose in Mrs. Vane's face. Seraphine's concern hardened at the edges. "Linnet," her mother said, low and urgent, "do not make this worse. I am not the one who made it anything." She curtsied, not deeply, not submissively, but with enough correctness to deny them complaint. Then she left the room. In the corridor, the air felt cooler. Her composure held until she reached the turn near the library. She stopped there, one hand against the wall, and closed her eyes. She had said the right thing. She knew it. Knowing did not make it painless. Behind her, the drawing-room door opened. Footsteps sounded, measured and familiar. "Miss Vane," Gideon said. She gathered herself before facing him. He stood at the end of the corridor, his gaze moving over her face with restrained concern. Beyond him, through the open door, the drawing-room had fallen into a silence too late to be innocent. He had arrived after the words that mattered. He had seen only her leaving. "Your Grace," she said. He took one step toward her, then stopped, as if he sensed that pursuit would wound where protection had once helped. In the drawing-room behind him, Seraphine's voice rose again, softer now, already repairing the damage. Linnet's face settled into calm. Gideon saw it, and something in his expression changed. Not pity, not admiration this time. Fear. For the first time, he looked like a man who understood that silence, if kept too long, could lose what it most wished to protect. "Come away from the corridor," Gideon said. It was not a command. If it had been, Linnet would have refused him at once. "I would prefer air," Linnet said. Gideon inclined his head and stepped aside. They walked without speaking until they reached the terrace. Twilight lay over the garden in long blue shadows. Gideon stopped near the library entrance, leaving enough distance between them for propriety and escape. "What happened in that room?" he asked. Linnet looked out over the lawn. "You heard nothing?" "Not enough. Enough to know I left." "Yes?" She turned then. "And what did you think? That I had taken offense too easily? That I had misunderstood some kindness? That I had let hope make me foolish?" "No," he said. "I thought you had been hurt." "Because I am so easily hurt?" "Because cruelty does harm even when it is spoken softly." For a moment she wanted to believe that answer could be enough. It was honorable. It was kind. Yet something in her had grown too tired to accept shelter in place of truth. "Your Grace," she said, "did you dance with me because you pitied me?" "No." "Then why?" He looked toward the darkening garden. "Because the room was cruel. Because Bristow behaved contemptibly. Because no lady should have been made to stand alone beneath such laughter." Linnet absorbed every word. Each one was correct. Each one was noble. None of them was love. "I see." His gaze returned to her. "You deserve respect, Miss Vane. I would never see you harmed. Respect, protection, honor." The words formed a beautiful cage. She reached into the pocket hidden in the fold of her gown and drew out the Old Ballad. It was her own copy, soft at the creases, carried for courage too many times to count. Sadness. This song comforted me because it belonged to no one else's judgment, she said. Not my mother's, not Seraphine's, not society's. I cannot live as an object rescued from room to room. If I am to be disliked, let me be disliked as myself. If I am to be overlooked, let me at least stand upright while it happens. But I will not become a small charitable act in a great man's life. His jaw tightened. That is not what you are. Then you should not have answered as though it were. She placed the ballad in his hand. His fingers closed over it slowly, as if he understood that she had given him something more serious than paper. Good evening, Your Grace. Miss Vane. But she had already curtsied and gone inside. Gideon remained on the terrace as the last light drained from the garden. The ballad lay in his hand, worn thin by her courage. For years, silence had protected him from mistake, ambition, and false tenderness dressed as devotion. Now silence had become its own betrayal. For the first time in a very long while, the Duke of Caldermere feared that caution had cost him the only woman who had never asked him to be a duke first. Fear morning came with the sound of trunks being moved. Linnet woke before the maid entered. She had slept little, but she felt strangely calm, as if something within her had finished pleading. Mrs. Vane arrived fully dressed, gloves already fastened, her mouth set in a line of maternal distress that had more pride than tenderness in it. "You are to go home this morning," she said. Linnet sat up. "Home? It is best. Your nerves have been overtaxed, and I cannot have this house party become a spectacle at your expense." "At my expense," Linnet repeated. Seraphine appeared behind their mother, pale and perfect in mourning muslin. "Do not make this harder than it must be, Linnet. Everyone will understand that you are fatigued." Linnet looked from one to the other. "And what am I to understand?" Mrs. Vane's expression sharpened. "That your sister's future must not be endangered by careless talk." There it was at last, bare enough to touch. Not concern, not protection, arrangement. Within an hour, Linnet stood in the front hall beside a modest trunk. Servants moved with the discreet speed of people pretending not to witness family humiliation. Lord Thornleigh looked deeply uncomfortable. Seraphine stood near the staircase, wearing sorrow as elegantly as lace. "It is kinder this way," Seraphine said. "You will be spared disappointment." Linnet rested one gloved hand on the trunk. "Whose disappointment?" Seraphine's eyes cooled. Before she could answer, the front doors opened to admit Gideon. He stopped at the sight of the trunk. Then his gaze moved to Linnet's face. "Miss Vane is leaving?" he asked. Mrs. Vane stepped forward at once. "Only for her health, Your Grace. The excitement has been too much for her." Seraphine lowered her eyes. "My sister has a tender heart. It would be cruel to let her mistake attention for intention." Gideon's expression became very still. Linnet knew that stillness now. She also knew that if he spoke first, she would remain what Seraphine had tried to make her, a woman passed from one person's decision to another's. "No," Linnet said. Every face turned. Her mother stared. "Linnet!" "Anger, I will not be hidden to protect another person's pride," she said. "Nor will I stay where I am treated as a burden to be managed. If I leave, it will be because I choose to leave. Not because my sister fears being outshone by a woman she has spent years calling invisible." Anger. Seraphine went white. Mrs. Vane whispered, "You forget yourself." "For once," Linnet said, "I remember myself." Gideon did not move toward her. He did not claim, command, or rescue. "Miss Vane," he said, "do you wish to remain?" No one had asked her that before. Linnet looked at the open door, at the carriage waiting beyond it, at the trunk beside her. Then she looked at Gideon. "Yes," she said, "but not as anyone's object of pity." His voice was low. "No, and not as a weapon against my sister. No, and not under the protection of words you are afraid to mean." That reached him. She saw it. Gideon bowed his head once. then I have much to amend." By evening, Thornleigh Hall had dressed itself again in music and candlelight, as if polished floors and roses could erase what had taken place beneath its roof. Linnet wore the same altered gown. She had considered changing, then refused. Let them see it. Let them remember the girl they had laughed at and compare her to the woman who now entered by choice. Seraphine watched from across the ballroom. Her beauty remained, but it no longer commanded the room with the same ease. Some guests still admired her. Others had begun to wonder about her. Wonder was dangerous. Seraphine knew it. As the musicians prepared, Seraphine crossed toward Linnet with Lady Durnford, near enough to hear. "How brave of you to appear," Seraphine said. "After this morning, I feared people might think you had stayed only because His Grace insisted." Linnet looked at her sister steadily. The old instinct urged silence. The new one did not shout. It simply stood. "No woman should be mocked for receiving kindness," Linnet said, "nor shamed for refusing pity." Lady Durnford's eyes sharpened with interest. Seraphine's lips parted. "I never—" "You did," Linnet said, "often, but I am finished helping you disguise it." The words were not cruel. That made them final. Gideon stepped beside Linnet then, not before she had spoken, but after. The distinction mattered so deeply that she nearly closed her eyes. "Lady Durnford," he said, his voice carrying just enough for the nearby guests. "Mrs. Vane, Miss Seraphine, there appears to be some confusion regarding my conduct." The ballroom quieted by degrees. "I first defended Miss Linnet Vane because this room was cruel," he said. "I seek her company now because she is the one woman here who has never performed affection for my title, never flattered my pride, and never asked me to mistake beauty for truth." Seraphine stood rigid, her color high. Gideon turned to Linnet. Before all of them, the formidable Duke of Caldermere looked not powerful but honest. "Positivity, Miss Vane," he said. "If you will permit it, I would court you openly, not from pity, not from obligation, from choice." Positivity. Linnet felt the room waiting for her answer. Once, that waiting would have crushed her. Now it held no authority greater than her own heart. "I will not be loved as an act of charity," she said. "No, nor chosen merely because you are angry on my behalf." "No." She searched his face and found, at last, no guarded courtesy standing between them. "Then you may court me, Your Grace." A breath passed through the room. Seraphine looked away first. Gideon offered his hand. "May I have the first dance?" Linnet placed her hand in his. "You may." This time, when they stepped into the set, she did not count the watchers. She heard only the music. Several weeks later, London received Linnet Vane with curiosity first, judgment second, and acceptance only when guided by rank. Gideon's rank guided it firmly. The ballroom in Grosvenor Square was brighter than Thornleigh Hall and filled with people who had heard versions of the story before seeing the woman herself. Linnet entered beside Mrs. Vane and Seraphine, but she no longer felt arranged behind them. She was greeted as the future Duchess of Caldermere. The words still felt strange, settling over the life of a woman who had once been advised to stand near walls. Seraphine offered a public courtesy early in the evening. It was stiff, imperfect, and witnessed by exactly the sort of people whose opinions she valued. Linnet accepted it without triumph. She had not needed her sister's defeat. She had needed her sister's power over her to end. Later, as the musicians gathered for the next dance, Gideon came to her side. "There is something I asked of them," he said. Before she could ask what, the first notes began. Linnet knew them at once. The Old Ballad moved through the London ballroom, no longer hidden in a reticule, no longer played in solitude or behind conservatory glass. It rose among chandeliers and silk gowns, among titles and whispers, as if it had always belonged there. Linnet turned to him. Gideon's voice was meant for her alone. "What once comforted you in loneliness should follow you into every room where you belong." For a moment, The bright world blurred at its edges, not from pain this time, but from a fullness she had no wish to hide. "You kept it," she said. "I learned it." That undid her more than any grand declaration could have done. He offered his hand. Linnet placed hers in it, not as the mocked sister, not as the rescued girl, not as Seraphine's contrast or society's brief amusement. As the ballad filled the room, Gideon led her into the dance. No one laughed. And Linnet understood, with a peace deeper than triumph, that the silence around her had changed. It was not fear of the Duke. It was not pity. It was not surprise. It was room. Room to be seen. Room to be loved. Room to belong. Beside the man who had found her at the edge of the ballroom and chosen her, not once in anger, but again and again in truth.